Hey, this is Walter Borgen, the broker and trainer at RE/MAX Signature in Daytona Beach. So today we're going to have a casual conversation and go over some important dates and timelines in the FAR bar as-is contract. This is the contract in our area that's most commonly used by most agents. So we're going to take some time to dig in here a little bit and just go over some important things. So I'm going to show you a couple tools that we have that make it really easy for you to follow along on these timelines, and it'll help keep your buyer informed as well. So if you're someone that's from another brokerage that's watching this, then you can certainly request these forms, but please review them with your broker or legal counsel before using them, because I'm just not sharing legal advice with you, but I'm going to show you some things, some tips and tricks that help keep us on track. So the first thing that I want to do is look at the contract, because before we can start talking about timelines, we have to know how time is actually defined in the contract. And this is often overlooked by a lot of agents. They don't take the time to look it up. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the contract and we're going to go to the standards of the contract. Now, I kind of classify the standards of the contract kind of as a glossary of terms or definition of terms in the contract. So we're going to go here, and it's going to be about line 420, I believe, is going to be time. And it's going to give us a great clear definition of exactly what time is. So here it is, section F of the contract. So what it's going to say here is, first, time is of the essence. That means that you have to have it done by the due date. The next thing we're going to notice, it says time is computed by calendar days, unless the period either begins or ends on a weekend or national holiday. So the great thing about this is it even gives you the code that you can Google search, this 5USC6103, and that'll give you a list of all of the national holidays. So now that we know what time is, it's calendar days, unless the period begins or ends on a weekend or national holiday. Then we're going to go ahead now and we can dive in and look at some of these important dates and timelines. So the first thing I'll show you is our contract timeline form. And this is kind of where we're going to spend most of our time today. This is a nice, simple form that you're able to use with your transactions to keep yourself on top of the different dates that you come across. You're welcome to share this with your customers as well, the loan officer, the title company, anybody else in the transaction if you'd like. This is just a simple form made in a PDF where you just click and type in the dates. So great form there. At the bottom, you'll see there's some important contacts that would be very common for you to use in the transaction and make it very handy for you to keep this in your paper file, and you have all of your information right there and handy. Now, we also have a Excel version of this file. So the Excel version of this file is really cool because you fill in a couple of these bolded sections. So you can put the effective date, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as what things you customized in the contract. So what days for receipt of contract, loan application, inspection period, and so forth. You'll fill those in and it'll calculate all of the timelines for you. And you can print that out and use the one on Excel. You can keep it on your computer, or you can transfer the information over to the other. Either way is fine, but both of these are very useful tools. And there again, if you'd like to get a copy of these tools, you are welcome to get a copy of these tools. Just click the link below and request a copy of our important timelines form. And we'll be glad to send you a copy of it. And if you're from another brokerage, make sure you review this with your broker or legal counsel before using these. I'm not going to be an attorney. I'm not giving you legal advice. These are just things that we use to stay on top of our game and on top of timelines and so forth. So the first thing that we're going to look at and we're going to talk about is effective date. So the effective date is the date that both parties have signed and agreed to all the terms in the contract. So pretty much all of your dates are going to be based off of that effective date. And so you'll put that in there, and that's our start point. The next common one that we come across that everybody's going to know of is going to be the escrow due date. So that's when the escrow deposit is due. Now, it's very important that we track that and follow up with it. So the default answer in the contract is 3 days from the effective date. So you have 3 days to check and confirm that deposit has been made. And if it hasn't, you got to make sure that both the buyer and seller know that deposit has not been made, and that creates a problem because that deadline was not reached. So follow up on that and make sure that it's also not only been made, but it clears later on down the road. So the next one to come to is inspection period. Now, we all know how the inspection period works. This is for an as-is contract, you're typically going to have 7 to 10 days. The default is 15, but for a lot of people, 15 is going to be a little longer than they're going to want to take their home off of the market. But don't make it too short, and don't allow buyers to eliminate it completely. It's important that they have time to do an inspection, and they should do an inspection. We never want to recommend to them that they just skip an inspection or waive an inspection of a property. So we want to give them ample time to do that, and we also need time for them to get additional inspectors out there if something comes up or goes wrong. So if a specialist for the roof is needed, or electrical or plumbing is needed, then we need to work on doing one of 3 things. These are your only 3 options when you come to a time period deadline, and that is to extend the contract, extend that time period for the inspection, or you can accept the property as it is, or you can try to cancel before that time period expires. So those are your only 3 options at this point, and we need to decide which one we're going to do. And because it takes a little bit of time to get an extension, you don't want to wait to the last minute. Any one of these time frames, you should be working on 2 to 3 days in advance to make sure that you have time to get that time frame signed and returned by both parties before it expires. So the next one that we're going to look at is our loan application, or loan approval. So we're going to look at loan approval because everyone knows when this is, and you got to be really careful here. You need to make sure that you've spoken to the lender first, and you know exactly how long it's going to take from the lender to get the approval and do the closing. A lot of agents make a big mistake because they pick a 30-day closing, or I should say the buyer or seller pick a 30-day closing, and we typically want to give at least 7 days prior to closing for loan approval. We don't want to have loan approval expire right at the end when the seller has already moved out of their house. So typically you're going to give 5 to 7 days before the closing date for that final loan approval to come. So if you have a 30-day contract, you can see how things are going to create, how problems are going to be created here, because the 30 days has already been cut down to 23, because we need to have it about 5 to 7 days before the closing date so that we have time to get our closing document and so forth done. And then we're also going to, oftentimes it takes a couple days of negotiation, 2 or 3 days of negotiating the contract before it actually gets together. So now if we take those extra 3 days off, we're down to maybe 20 days, 18 to 20 days now that the lender has to get loan approval. Now, the next thing that comes in is if the buyer doesn't turn his paperwork in on time, or it takes him a little bit to get it to the lender, or the lender can't review it, or something happens. There's many things that can happen. Somebody could call in sick. There could be a major storm. There could be all kinds of things that could delay this. Now that could take another 2, 3, 4 days, or it could fall on a weekend or something else. Now we've even pushed it back further. So now we're looking at the lender has 10, 15 days, 17 days to do the whole loan approval. Okay, so that's a lot of pressure on the lender. So my recommendation to you is that you have 45-day closings or longer, unless you're very confident that your buyer has all their paperwork to the lender. You can get it all done in that time, and you've spoken to the lender to make sure that they can get this loan approval done in this short window of time. So just a quick review there. I'd recommend that you have your loan approval due date about 7 days prior to the expiration period, like before the closing period. So about 7 days prior to the closing period. And again, if you get to this point, and this often happens, where the lender does not have the loan approval ready by that time, they tell you everything looks good, but I can't give you a loan approval. My recommendation is you got to do one of 3 things. You're either going to ask for an extension of that loan approval, or you're going to accept it without a loan approval, remove the financing contingency, and move forward. Or you can submit a notice of cancellation that you're canceling the contract because you were not able to get your loan approval in the time that was required. So that's the conversation that you need to have. The same thing that you did during the inspection period, you have to have at the loan approval time so that you know exactly where you're going from there. Now, there is a small window in there. If you decide to waive the financing contingency and move forward, the seller has 3 days to be able to cancel that contract if you didn't provide the loan approval. But after that, you'll be able to move forward with no financing contingency. So The last thing that you're going to have is a closing, and the closing date, remember, you're going to have if you have financing involved, you're going to need to have your closing document out, 3 to 5 days before closing. That buyer needs to have received the closing document, which is another reason that loan approval needs to be done at least 7 days prior to closing. So you're going to know if you're on track there. So now, in order for loan approval to happen, there's a bunch of other time frames in here that people often overlook or don't pay attention to. Those were the major ones that we all know and are very big and are very obvious: the escrow date, the inspection period, and the loan approval, and the closing date. But the ones that are often overlooked and can cause problems and bite you in the end are some like these. Here's leases or estoppels. Many agents don't realize or know that if the property is tenant occupied, or there's going to be leases that extend past the closing date, that you have to provide copies of those leases to the buyer within 5 days of the effective date. Or the buyer can cancel at any time, because they have to be able to review those leases and in their sole discretion make sure that they work for them, or they can cancel the contract. So if you don't get them the copies, you're putting yourself at jeopardy, and that's often overlooked. Another time frame that's often overlooked is your HOA or condo documents. So with a homeowners association, you really should have all of the homeowners documents, the fees and the rules and the covenants and restrictions, all of that before the person signed the contract, so that they have time to review it. With a condominium, it's a little bit different. With a condominium, you're going to request that information, and you're going to add a condominium rider to the contract. This condominium rider is going to very specifically ask for the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, the covenants and restrictions, the finances of the building. And then I recommend that you ask for the most recent minutes, at least 3 copies of the most recent minutes, so that you know what's going on at that association. And the buyer has 3 days to review this. After that 3-day period, they can't cancel, but before the 3-day period, they can. And that's for resale condos or non-developer owned. Developer or new construction, they're going to have about 15 days to review that information. So most of you are going to be using this, considering that it's going to be a resale condo. So that's an important date that's often overlooked. Another thing that's thrown in there is if financing is involved, in order to get the loan approval, the title commitment needs to be done and complete, and the lender has to review it, which means the survey has to be done and the appraisal has to be done. So in the contract, it's going to reference 2 different sections. It's going to say the title policy review, if financing is involved, is 15 days prior to closing. Or if it's a cash sale, is only 5 days prior to closing. Okay, so you really have to make sure that, and for that title policy to be done, that you have your survey done and everything else, so that you can get that done 15 days prior to closing. So we mentioned here your survey and your elevation certificate. Well, we want to get started on these right away as well, so that we have time to get them for the title commitment as well as the lender. And if it's in a flood zone, this is where the elevation certificate is going to be required. So you need to be able to figure this stuff out while you're finding out your insurance information. So we don't want to wait too long to order the survey and check on insurance to find out if we're going to need an elevation certificate, or if the property is in a flood zone. So the contract gives you 20 days to get your flood insurance and to find out if it's in a flood zone. I recommend that all of that's done during the inspection period, but there is a clause in the contract that says that the buyer has up to 20 days to determine if it's in a flood zone, and if it is, they have the right to be able to cancel. So we have our homeowners insurance and flood and any other kind of bonds. We want to get those early so that they know about them. And then also our appraisal. We can't get the loan approval unless the appraisal is done. So I want you to think about this. We're going to go from an escrow to, we have our inspection date we're focused on. While we're doing our inspections, we should be looking up insurance. We should be ordering the survey. And we should be checking to make sure that the appraisal is done and being ordered. We should have already provided all of the condominium documents and all of the HOA documents and any leases that are on the property as well. So now we've done all of that, we're able to get to the loan approval date. And once we get to the loan approval date, we should have a pretty good idea, because all of the information's been removed, and the buyer will decide if they got the loan approval and they're going to move forward, if they need to extend or if they need to cancel. The last thing is going to be our Cfpb closing document is due. And like I said, that is going to be due minimum 3 days if it's electronically sent, and possibly 5 days depending on how it's sent. So 3 to 5 days before closing, if that CD has not been done and complete, then you're not going to be closing. So that's a great indication. You shouldn't end up at the closing table and realize that this hasn't been done. So those are the basics of these dates, and these important dates are things for you to pay attention to and walk through step by step by step. And this is a great tool, a great form for you to use, as well as this Excel sheet is a great form for you to use as well. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. Like I said, this is a quick informal discussion about this, and during our classes we get a little more in depth in this. We dive a little bit further. We show you how to use it, make sure that you have checklists and things in place so that you can proceed to closing with all the information that you need. So I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions or need anything, reach out. If you'd like a copy of these forms, please click the link below and request the information. Thanks a lot. Bye.